Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is accessing web services. So essentially there's going to be three ways you can do that using Xojo. I'm going to give an overview here and then we'll look at one way in particular. So the original mechanism for talking with web services was to use either httpsocket or http secure socket. These two classes only support HTTP 1.0. They've been around for quite a long time. And actually, HTTP socket itself was deprecated in the last Xojo release, so 2018 release 4. So instead, you should be using, at the very least, HTTP secure socket or something newer, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. These two sockets use string for getting data in and out. They do have a mechanism for synchronous connections. And they predate iOS, so they do not have any iOS support. So you can only use these older ones on desktop, web, and console projects. And you can find the doc page for HTTP secure socket here. A newer socket that was released a few years ago is Xojo.net.http socket. And this socket uses HTTP 1.1. So you get better compatibility with most web services and websites. This socket is supported on all platforms, including iOS. It does make use of other related classes and data types. So it does require text. It requires a Xojo.core memory block, Xojo.io folder item, if you're downloading files, and Xojo.core.text encoding if you need to convert binary data to text and back. So all of these companion classes in the Xojo namespace are required to use HTTP socket or to use Xojo.net.http socket. This socket also does not have any support for synchronous connections. Everything is asynchronous by using events. And you can find the doc page for this socket here. This socket handles both secure and insecure connections. There's no split between classes like there is with the original ones. And the new one I want to show you today is URLConnection. And this was added in the last Xojo release, 2018 release 4. And it is part of API 2.0, part of our revamping of the Xojo framework to add new capabilities. And this supports HTTP 1.1 and later because it's using OS mechanisms for communications. Whatever is built into the operating system is what this works through. It uses string, not text. But this does mean at this point it is not yet supported on iOS. It is intended to be supported on iOS when iOS gets the string type added to it, but that is not quite available yet. URLConnection adds back the ability to do synchronous connections. And you can find the doc page on that here at the URLConnection page. And when we look at this in a moment, you'll see it's pretty similar to Xojo.net.http socket. So overall usage, how do you go about using this? Well, once you get a URL connection set up, you can just put one on a window layout if you want. You'll send the request to a URL, and you can use the send method for that or the send sync method if you need a synchronous. If you want to send synchronously. And then if you are doing things asynchronously, you're going to get an event when the data is returned. And that will be either the content received event or the file received event, depending on what you actually requested. And that's pretty much it. It's very similar to how you work with the HTTP sockets in the past. And before we jump into a demo, I wanted to talk briefly about app transport security. This is covered in this doc page here, but this only applies to iOS and macOS. And I'm bringing it up now because it now applies to both. Originally, it was only something to worry about on iOS, but starting with 2018 release 4, we upgraded the macOS SDK to a newer version. And in that newer version, Apple has implemented app transport security. So if you're building your apps using 2018 release 4, and that app is running on OS 10, 10.11 or later, you can run into app transport security, which essentially means that all the URLs that you access must be secure, or an exception is raised by the operating system. So you can't easily access HTTP things. They want you to have URLs that are HTTPS. There is a way around that, of course, and you can see here I have two P-lists that are shown on the screen. And what you would do is you create a P-list and note your exceptions to this rule. So if you have an insecure site that you want to access, you can use the P-list on the right to include the specific domain names. And then your app will be able to access them. It won't be able to access anything that's not in there. And then the P-list that's on the left essentially just says, hey, ignore this app transport security thing. I want to be able to access whatever, anything. So it will allow insecure access to any HTTP sites. Now, if you're building your own apps, you can use either of these, whatever is appropriate for you. Obviously, the smaller P-list on the left is super easy. It brings back things so they work how they did in the past. But if you are submitting to an app store, either the Mac App Store or the iOS App Store, you need to be a bit more specific. Apple doesn't really love it if you go with the left P-list and just say, hey, I want to access everything. You're going to probably need a pretty good reason so that they don't reject you. Otherwise, you can use the P-list technique on the right and include the specific domains you're accessing, and all should be good. So let's take a look at Xojo here and take a look at this URL connection. All right, so I have here a project. And this is just going to connect to the Eddie's Electronics web service that we host on Xojo Cloud. And it just gives you back a list of all the customers that are in that database, or you can get back a specific customer. So first I'll run it, and then we'll look at what the source code here looks like. So if I do a get all, this is going to send the request up to the server to get back a list of all the customers. And then they're just displayed here in the list box. And then this one here is just getting a specific customer using their ID and then displays their name. So you can see what I have on here is, first of all, I have a URL connection that is added as a essentially an invisible control here on the shelf on the layout. You can see it's super set to URL connection. And the way to add these to your own layouts is, what I do is I just grab the generic object here and drag it over. And then in the inspector, change the super to a URL connection. And then, you give it whatever name you want. And then add the events that you need. So here you can see I am using the URL connection object that's on the layout. And I'm calling the send method, and I'm saying send a get request, and I provide the URL to the web service. This particular web service sends back JSON containing all the customer information. When that is received, the content received event is called. And here I'm just clearing the text area, and then I grab the information that was received. So first I'm making sure I set an encoding on the data coming in, because data that comes in across the internet by default is not really going to have an encoding. So here I'm making sure it's set as UTF-8, and then I'm loading it up into, it's coming in as, this point it'll be text, so I'm loading it into a JSON item so I can process it as JSON. And then here I have just to check to make sure that I got back the JSON that it contains all the customers. So it has that as a header. And then if it does, I can essentially grab the part of the JSON I need, which will contain all the names, and then loop through it and display it all in the list box. And if I'm getting back the JSON that just has a single customer, it'll have that in the header. And then I can just grab that section of the JSON and then grab the single entry that's in it for first name and last name. And you can see the get ID button code, pretty similar, although this is passing in a little bit more information. Get all doesn't have to provide any information because it's just getting back everything. But this here, we do want to supply the ID for the customer we want. So that is created as JSON and then set here in the request content. And then that's sent off to the web service as a post request. And then the JSON comes back with that particular customer's information. So you can see not really a lot of code here to be able to do this. It's all pretty straightforward. You send your request, in the content received, you deal with what was returned. All right, so now I want to just show a kind of before and after for what code looks like using the HTTP socket, and then what it would look like using URLConnection. So, and this one also will show off the app transport security issue. So here I have a little app that calls a web service to format SQL. So you can see this SQL is badly formatted. The commands are all in lowercase, except this one's in uppercase. And it doesn't look great. So we can send this off to a web service and get back SQL that's formatted more the way we want. So what I actually ended up doing here is I just created a simple class that just is a subclass of HTTP socket. I didn't really need to do this. Could have just done it directly on the window because there's no code on that class, but that's how that's set up here. And you can see, again, the overall technique remains the same. You call your URL with the send method. So this is an older HTTP socket. It's got a little bit more code around it. Some of this is because of the conversion between text and string, and same thing with memory block and stuff and encodings. So you can see here, it's just setting up the URL by providing the SQL as a parameter, setting that, and then calling the request as specified by the API. And then when that request is received in an HTTP socket, it calls the page received event. The data is converted from binary back to text, and then a JSON, and then we grab the section of the JSON we want that has the formatted SQL. Now, if I run this, it's not really going to work because of app transport security. So I run it here. The error event is raised. And if we click on the error, we can click on the message here, and it tells you why. It says it couldn't do it because app transport security requires a secure connection. Unfortunately, this web service does not offer a secure connection. So we have to use the plist option. So this is what the plist is that I'm using. And, like I showed before, it's pretty simple. It just has the overall structure, which you have to manage. And then it has the particular domain that I want to be able to access insecurely. So I need to add that plist to this project, which can be done just by taking the file and dragging it in here. And then when you run it again, that plist will be included in the build so that when you run, everything works. And here we've gotten back the SQL that is formatted more typically with commands on each line, major commands uppercase, etc. So that's what that looks like using httpsocket. And let's compare it to URLConnection. And with this approach here, same general design, although I didn't go with a separate class that I did there. I just put it directly on here since that's what I really wanted in the first place. And you can see same general setup. You have to grab the SQL from the text area that you want to do. You got to set it up, the parameters you want to pass. Still have to encode things. And then you got to set the request content. So this is a little shorter because it doesn't have to convert the text from into a memory block, essentially. Pass it along. It can just be passed along as a string. And then URLConnection, the event is called content received instead of page received here. You can again see the code is pretty much the same. Got to define the encoding for the what has come back. That's a little simpler because we just have to call define encoding here instead of do this conversion. And then once you have the information in the string here, it's just loaded into a JSON item. And then we grab the section we want. And pretty much the same thing is done here, except it's parsed into a dictionary. So the JSON text parsed into a dictionary. And then same thing, we grab the section we want. So tweaking your code here is usually pretty straightforward and sometimes does result in a little bit less code. And the end results are the same. This already has the info plist in here, so I think it should just run. Yep. All right, and the last before and after I want to show here is just the Eddie's Electronics example. This is a more complicated example. This is one of our major demo projects that we showcase. And this one was recently updated to switch over how the maps are displayed. Previously, this was using a Google map in an HTML viewer, but now it is using the Mapbox API to just grab a static image to show here. And it's doing that using a web service. So you can see, if I open up the controls here, that there are essentially two sockets here. There's a socket to get the location based on the city, state, and zip. And then there's another socket to get the actual map image. And again, the process is pretty straightforward. This is using two sockets because it's essentially making two different web API calls. So the first thing here in the request map method is just grabbing the information to get a location, calling the URL to get a geocoded location, and then sending that off to, or creating the URL, and then sending that off to the location socket, whose responsibility it will be to get that location. And when that gets the data back, the overall steps are always the same. You convert the content you got back into the format you need. In this case, it's going to be JSON, so it's converted all back into a dictionary so things can be looked up. And then once the geocode location is used, that is put together in another URL so that it can be sent to the map socket to get the actual map image back. And then the map socket, the data that is coming back here, is binary data in this case instead of JSON text type data. So that is loaded into a picture, saved on a property of the window, and then the canvas is told to redraw itself, and the canvas just draws the picture. So that's the overall steps. And if you look at the URLConnection version, you'll see primarily the same things. So the request map method is here. Again, very similar, just putting together the information and then sending the request off to get the location. Here that calls this location connector, which is a URL connection. And then this is, again, taking the data, processing it as JSON, grabbing out the parts we need, constructing a new URL, and then sending that information off to the map connector to get the actual image. And then that gets the image back and loads that into a picture property and invalidates the canvas. The new version also has a little bit extra code to actually grab a high DPI image from Mapbox if your app is running on a high DPI display. So that's what some of this little bit of extra code is. But otherwise, the steps are the same if the specific commands are slightly different. All right, so that's a few usages of URLConnection. You can read more about it here. See a few other examples. There are some example projects included in your Xojo download that show how this works, if you want to try that on your own. And now I want to remind people that we are in 2019, and that means the Xojo Developer Conference is right around the corner. Actually, May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and it's in Miami, Florida this year, sunny Miami. And the hotel is this hotel you see right here, the Marriott, that's right on the water. Should be gorgeous. We got a great rate for hotel rooms at $149 a night, so we have a lot of people that are arriving early to enjoy the whole area, or maybe staying later afterwards. So I encourage you to check out the site, xojo.com/XDC. Register if you haven't already. You can check out the full session list, see all the presenters, and all that good stuff. I can always be reached via email at paul@xojo.com. And you can find me on Twitter @Lefevre. And I do like to remind people to always head over to xojo.com/download, where you can download the latest version. If you have a current license, that of course means you can immediately use it. And if you don't have a license, you can still download the latest version and try it out. See what the new features are, read the release notes, try your projects in it, and maybe they'll add something that you want to take advantage of. All right, I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.